I'll ask Kalpa Rajapaksa to moderate this session.
Thank you very much, Comrade Sumanasili, and thank you very much, Comrade Michael Roberts, for accepting our invitation. You are not a stranger to Marx School. You have done a lecture a few years ago, actually, 1 year ago, maybe. So I welcome all of you.
I'm getting older, Kalpa. I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it's back in 2021, I believe. So,
all right.
Once again,
during the COVID-10.
Exactly. Yeah. So thank you so much again for accepting our invitation. And also we welcome all the comrades from around the world and from Sri Lanka. Let me give you a very brief introduction, even though he's not a stranger to many of you. Let me give you a very brief introduction to Comrade Michael. Comrade Michael worked in the City of London as an economist for over 40 years. At the same time, he was a political activist in the labor movement for decades. Since retiring, he has written several books: The Great Recession, A Marxist View, published in 2009, The Long Depression, published in 2016, Marx 200, A Review of Marxist Economics, which published in 2018, and jointly with Guglielmo Carcetti as editor of World in Crisis, published in 2018. And the most recent book that he published with, once again, with Guglielmo Carcetti was Capitalism in the 21st Century Through the Prism of Value. And he has published numerous papers in various academic journals and articles in leftist publications. And as many of you know, he's writing this very popular blog. I learned so much from his blog, The Next Recession. You all can visit his blog, and he's writing numerous articles there. And also he wrote an article about Sri Lankan economic crisis in the recent past, which published in 2009 March 24th. And you can read that article in his blog. So without further delay, I would hand over the floor to Comrade Michael. And you can ask your questions. If you have any comments regarding his presentation, lecture, you can do that after the lecture. Thank you so much once again, Comrade. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak again, and on a subject which I think is important for the understanding of Marxist economics, and also for the understanding of how capitalism works or doesn't work in this case, because the law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall, something that Marx developed and is outlined mostly in Capital Volume 3, but also in other places, I think Marx considers as very important for us to understand why capitalism has crises, why it is a system which doesn't meet the needs of the world's population, except for a very, very small minority. Now, in order to explain this law and the theory behind it, I'm going to present a few slides for you so that you can share and follow the thing. This is better in this case because there is a little bit of a, how can I put it, formulas involved and definitions involved, so it's better to be able to see them. So I'm just going to try and share that with you. Right, so I think you can see that, guys. Marx's law of tendency to rate of profit to fall. Now, let's start with the most important thing about capitalist production. Capitalist production is not to meet the social needs of the world's population. That's not its primary aim. Of course, people have to need things and want things for capitalism to sell them. But the fundamental motive of capitalist production to meet people's needs is actually profit. And the point is that capitalism is engaged in a process of production. If there's no profit, it won't produce and it won't invest to get that production. And this fundamental motive obliges every individual capitalist to strive in the labour process against labour in general, in order to exploit as much as they can of profit out of the workers that they're employing, to increase the amount of labor time that they don't have to pay for, and reduce the amount of labor time they have to pay for in wages and other benefits to the workers they employ. At the same time, each individual capitalist is in quite severe competition with other individual capitalists in order to get a greater proportion of the total amount of profit or surplus value, unpaid labor time, that the workforce in the world or in any country is producing. So there are two parts of this striving of capitalism. First of all, to maximize the amount of profit they can get out of workers, which Marx calls surplus value, and also to increase the share of the total profits being produced by capitalists as a whole, that share going to that particular capitalist over others. So that's the battle that's going on all the time in the capitalist process of production. Now, Marx said, if we want to analyze this better, he had a law, which he called the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which he considered in every respect the most important law of modern political economy and the most essential for understanding what is going on in capitalism. It's the most important law from the historical viewpoint, and also generally because it's quite simple, it's not really been always grasped and understood by everybody. And lying behind that is what I've just said before, that the rate of profit, it becomes the motive power of capitalist production. Things are only produced as long as they produce profit. There are two basic assumptions for Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And they come from two other laws of motion or major realistic assumptions that Marx makes about capitalism. First of all, he says that only labor creates value. Think about it. Machines to produce nothing unless workers press the button and put them on. Or, if you like, in the very modern situation, laborers produce an AI software which starts the process. But we haven't reached the stage where machinery, equipment, factories produce things on their own. We still need human labor, and only human labor therefore creates new value. Yes, it's created a machine in the past, so there's value in the machine that's embodied in the past, but all new value has to be created by laborers going to work. So if they don't go to work, as we know in a strike, or they're ill, then nothing gets produced. That's the first realistic law, the law of value, if you like, the labor theory of value, which Marx bases his understanding of the process of capitalism. The second is that the capitalists will accumulate more capital over time. There is a necessity for the capitalists to continue to invest in more production, more labor if they can, but also increase the amount of machinery and equipment and technology they've got relative to what they spend on workers. Because if they can reduce the amount that they have to spend on workers and keep the value of labor power or wages to the minimum, then they can increase the amount of profit that they're making. So there's a tendency in the process over time in capitalist production for the amount of investment in machinery, in factories, in other technologies and raw materials to rise relative to the amount that's being invested in wages and in labor's benefits. This ratio Marx called the organic composition of capital. In other words, it was a process organically changing all the time in the process of capitalism, but there will be a tendency for the rise in that ratio, the organic composition of capital, the ratio between how much is spent by capitalists overall on machinery and technology relative to what they spend on labor power. So those are the two basic assumptions from which follows the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Marx's simple formula for the rate of profit, S here, is the capitalist starts with the money to invest in. So the means of production are the fixed capital, the assets we've talked about, technology and so on, and the raw materials that are circulating around have to be used to produce things. Marx called that means of production constant capital. It was constant because it didn't add any value. It had value within it, but that value was constant according to what had been produced before. The labor force then uses those means of production to produce commodities, it gets paid in wages, and what it gets paid in wages is called variable capital. It's variable according to Marx because the labour force produces more value than it's paid in wages. So there's extra value produced. When the capitalist pays a workforce in wages, there will be more value produced. So there's variable capital. And then the other part of the formula is surplus value. The labour force produces commodities that contain surplus value, and it gets be able to sell those commodities on the market for more than it pays in wages to the workers who have produced the goods. That surplus is a surplus value. That is, in effect, if you like, the overall basis of profit. So if we're looking at the formula of the top line here, we can see that the rate of profit is the amount of profit produced by the capitalists as a whole and how much they've spent in order to achieve that production and get that profit. How much they've spent on constant capital, the means of production, and how much they spent on the workers' variable capital, their wages. So the overall total amount of profit is divided by the amount that the capitalists have had to spend on those two aspects. That's the formula for the rate of profit. And so we can say the rate of profit is S over C plus V. And here is the trick, if you like. And what I'm going to do is divide all the algebra up there, S, C, and V, by the value of labour power, by V. So if I divide S by V, I get S over V. And if I divide C by V, I get C over V, or V plus 1. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the rate of profit will fall if the bottom line on this equation at the bottom here, the C over V, the organic composition of capital, which we discussed before, if that rises faster than the rate of surplus value, the amount of profit relative to the amount spent on wages, then the rate of profit will fall. It's a logical conclusion. It's just a logic from the algebra itself. If, on the other hand, so if the C over V rises faster, Marx says that's the tendency under capitalism all the time, but there are times when S over V rises faster, and that's one of the counter tendencies to the rate of profit just falling flat out. And that helps you, I think, to explain the key point here between the tendency, which is the rising organic composition of capital, down here, C over V, and one of the counter tendencies, probably the most important, changes in the rate of surplus value. So in this law, that's why it's a law of the tendency, not just the law, it's the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. There are tendencies and counter tendencies. The tendency is the law as such, the rising organic composition of capital, which most of the time will outstrip any rise in the rate of exploitation or surplus value. That was Marx's argument. The counter tendencies are many. First, maybe the rate of surplus value, the amount of exploitation that you can get out of the workforce, can rise more than the organic composition of capital. But Marx argues that that doesn't happen forever. Sometimes new technology can be so cheap, so costing hardly anything at all, that actually the C doesn't rise as fast as the V in the organic composition of capital, so you get a fall in C over V, not a rise. But again, that Marx would argue, in reality, that doesn't happen very often, certainly very rarely. Then if you speed up the whole process of production by turning over the amount of raw materials and workforce you've got to make them work harder, you can increase the rate of profit as a result of an increase in turnover of capital. But generally, turnover of capital is relatively stable in any one period. And there are other ways of getting extra rate of profit or extra profit out of the system. That is, you start buying financial assets. That means that the rate of profit in the productive sectors, producing goods and services, will fall, but some capitalists can get more by buying stocks and bonds and speculating in that. And then, of course, if you're a national economy, you might be able to get a better rate of profit by exporting your capital and moving your location, your manufacturing locations abroad, or other methods of increasing the amount that you can exploit workers abroad and get the extra surplus value from there through the process of what we would like to call imperialism. But you can see the fundamental counter tendency is whether the rate of surplus value can outstrip the organic composition of capital. And it's a law because what Marx is saying is that it's like a law of gravity. We can predict that if we drop the stone, it will inevitably fall to the ground because the stone has fallen to the ground before. It's a law of gravity. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't counter tendencies to making that stone fall, but the basic tendency, the law, is that the stone will fall to the ground because of because of the law of gravity. So Marx is making the same point, that basically there will be a tendency for the rate of profit to fall because the organic composition of capital will rise faster than anything else. There could be counteracting factors to gravity. It might be wind, it might be a building, it might be a fact that you can climb in a tree. There are ways to reverse the law of gravity and the impact. But in the end, it's still applying. That law is still applying across the board to humanity, to the planet. And same applies to Marx's law in terms of profitability. That law is applying all the time. A tendency for the rate of profit to fall, while it can be overcome at certain periods. Now, there are critics of this particular theory that Marx has presented. One of the main ones, it's not the only one, comes from Nobuhiro Okishio, a Japanese Marxist economist, who says, look, this can't be right. We can't have falling profitability all the time because otherwise capitalists would not invest. And he says, look, no capitalist would introduce a new technology unless it raised the rate of profit, not reduced the rate of profit. Why would you invest in something that didn't raise the rate of profit? Capitalists introduce new techniques in order to lower the costs of production and therefore raise the profit that they get out of the process. So it doesn't make any sense to say that the rate of profit would tend to fall over time. You see, what would happen is the innovating capitalist would steal a march on the others by being able to reduce its cost of production against the prevailing market price that all the other capitalists are competing over in the market. So, but that's achieved primarily by taking some of the profits from the other capitalists, because if you're the innovating capitalist, you've got the advantage competitively because you have the better cost situation in production. So you can take a bigger market share and some of the profits from the other capitalists. So the other capitalists have to react. This is the process of competition is inevitable. They must react by introducing the same or even better technology that lowers their costs too, to compete with the leading capitalist. And that raises a certain problem, because it means that the productivity of the existing or probably reduced labor force for all the capitalists rises, and it lowers the value per unit of product. So the situation is, once all the capitalists have introduced this new technology, the organic composition of capital would have risen because everybody's got a new technology and reduced the costs of labor, perhaps by employing labor less, or maybe simply spending more on technology than they have on labor. The organic composition will rise, and as we know, that's the law. The law will mean that the rate of profit would fall, particularly because what will happen with increased productivity is that the value per unit of production would have fallen. So other things being equal, the general rate of profit overall, once everybody introduces the same new technology, and there's no one advantage for one capitalist over the other, is that you have a higher rate of organic composition of capital and therefore a lower general rate of profit. So here is the irony of the situation. Capitalists go in to try and get a bigger rate of profit by gaining an advantage over others, but as they all compete and introduce this technology, actually they drive up in general the level of the organic composition of capital, and therefore the general rate of profit will fall. I can go a bit more into some of the deficiencies of Okishio's theory, but I'm not going to do that because we may want to discuss that a bit later in more detail. But let me just make one point. That is, I think Okishio has succumbed to what we call the fallacy of composition, or at least Keynes did once. It's an example where it simply sums the gain of one individual capitalist to the whole capitalist economy. What seems good for one individual capitalist is not necessarily good for the profitability of the whole capitalist economy. because when everybody introduces that new technology, overall profitability falls. So each individual capitalist will attempt to gain an advantage, and as it does so, it will increase the organic composition of capital and start to lower the profit rate in general. So moreover, each individual capitalist is not doing this voluntarily, as Akisho seems to imply, but because of the necessity to compete. It's not a voluntary decision. It's that they have to look at ways of increasing their advantage over other capitalists and increasing the profitability that they get out of the workforce. So there's a continual necessity to compete, to look for new technologies, not to lose market share. So as Marx says, the law of value and profitability begins to operate behind the backs of the capitalists. It's not in their conscious control to sustain a higher rate of profit because they're competing with each other and they're creating a situation where this organic composition of capital rises. Now, let me just digress slightly and point out that Marx's law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall, as expounded in volume 3 of Capital in particular, if you want to see it, it's in chapters 13 to 15 and explained and more clearly edited by Engels, who edited those chapters. But that law of the tendency rate of profit to fall, which I think is key, and which apparently Marx thought was the most important law of political economy, is not actually supported by the majority, not only of people who are not Marxist economists, but most Marxist economists do not accept that this is the best theory to understand why there are crises in capitalism. There are other theories which are presented. This little matrix here says that one of the key ideas that cause crises in capitalism is a lack of effective demand, namely that workers cannot buy back all the commodities that they've produced for the capitalists. And there's a lack of effective, like a chronic underconsumption in the market. That's mean the lack of demand, workers don't have enough consumption power to buy all the goods. Or there is too much production of capital goods, that's technology, factories and so on, and not enough production of consumer goods, and therefore there's an imbalance, a disproportion in the process of capitalism. Those are two alternative theories to the profitability theory explaining capitalist crises. Now, if we're on the lack of profits, which you'd think would cover Marx's law, other people don't accept that the falling rate of profit theory, where the bottom right one, is necessarily an explanation for lack of profits. There is also the argument of a profit squeeze, namely that workers raise their wages so much that they squeeze the profits of capitalists, and that causes the crisis. It's the profit squeeze explanation, which is not very widely supported these days, but was when I was as young as some of you I can see, back in the 60s and 70s, that was a very powerfully theory presented that workers were asking for too much wages and causing capitalism to go into crisis. So you can see that there are other theories related to the nature of crisis. So what we're trying to do is relate the question of the rate of profit to getting crises under capitalism. First, let me deal with underconsumption briefly. And let's just take this remark by Marx in Capital Volume 2. He says, it's a sheer tautology to say that crises are caused by the scarcity of effective consumption. That commodities become unsaleable means that only that no effective purchase has been found for them. And he goes on to say, this is like saying really that crises are always the result of workers having too little wages. And it would imply that if wages rise and capitalists and workers get a larger share of consumption, then the crisis would be resolved. But that is not what Marx believed was correct. And that, as Engels says, this underconsumption, well, workers are always under-consuming, if you like. They never had enough to make their lives reasonable. So it doesn't really explain the regular and recurring crises under capitalism just to adopt this theory. But it's a very, very strong theory, not supported particularly by Keynesian economists, but also by Marxist economists in the past, like Rosa Luxemburg, and still by many today. But if we look at the evidence for this particular underconsumption theory, it's not very strong at all. In every US recession since 1940, 1975, it has not been a fall in consumption levels that has emerged before a slump, but a fall in business investment levels. As you can see on the graph to the right, personal consumption is the blue dot, and investment, business investment by the capitalists, is the green bar. And GDP is the actual collapse or reduction otherwise in total output. You can see that in virtually every of those crisis years that I've got here of about 6, consumption hardly drops because households have to go on paying for energy, food and basics and running up debts. But investment is the big swing factor. This is a measure of the collapse in or reduction in business investment compared to consumption 1 year before the big slump. So as you can see, from peak to a trough, take 1974-5, business investment fell 20%, consumption didn't fall at all, and you had a fall of 2.6% on average in the US economy's GDP. So you can see that it's actually investment which is key. And it's not surprising if you think that capitalism only produces if profits are being made, and if profits are falling, then it's investment that will be hit, not consumption by the workers immediately. And as the other Marxist theory of crises, which is still has some base of support, is the idea of disproportion, namely that it's, if you like, the flip side of consumption. It's not that there's a lack of consumption, it's there's too much capacity produced, there's overproduction of capacity. The investment sector outstrips the consumption sectors, causing imbalance and a lack of demand for goods. But actually, investment is always outstripping consumption. If we look at the measure of gross product in any economy, you will find that large sections of what is taking place is investment in capital goods, in production, machinery, raw materials, and so on, and intermediate goods right across the board in the economy in order to make it grow. So in a sense, investment is always outstripping consumption, otherwise there'll be no growth. So it can't be the cause as such of recurrent crises, because in fact, even when investment and consumption are in alignment, they're still crises. And I'm going to try and develop that a little bit more. The other third theory, which is now extremely popular amongst some Marxists and other socialist economists, is that what's wrong is financial collapse. It's an greedy, excessive credit, financial speculation, over credit expansion by banks and other financial institutions. Marx makes the point that, yes, credit is necessary to a capitalist production because they can't build bridges which collapse or get smashed by container ships immediately. It requires the build-up of resources in order to do that over many years. So you can get credit in advance. You borrow the money in order to make the investment, and you pay it back over years. So credit system is an important process of boosting the economy, but it can also be a lever of overproduction and excessive speculation in commerce when it reaches the point. But what is the point of credit, excessive credit, has to be measured. Why is credit that's expanding not excessive 1 year and excessive the next year? Why can you have crises even without credit, says Marx at some point. So clearly the credit argument on its own, or too much debt, is not an explanation of why we get regular and recurring crises. So let me just go back to the rate of profit. We argued Marx's argument for the law of the rate of profit is that there will be a tendency for the rate of profit to fall because realistically over time the organic composition will rise over time, and most of the time it will outstrip any increase of counteracting factors like a rise in the rate of surplus value. So is that empirically true? Well, here's a measure of a world rate of profit. This is not done by me. I have added a bit to this, but this is done by Esteban Maito from Argentina many years ago. He looked at 14 countries, he merged them together in a weighted average, and he looked at how the rate of profit had gone across the board for those 14 countries, including all the major ones that we know about, not including Sri Lanka, as you may not be surprised. But you can see that over the period since Marx wrote Capital, that the rate of profit on the whole has fallen, not in a straight line. There are periods when there's been a recovery, particularly in wars, and in periods when After wars, have quite high rate of profit, the golden age in the 1945 to mid-60s, but there's been big declines in the rate of profit too. And now as we reach into the 21st century, you can see that the rate of profit is way, way lower on this measure than it was in the late 19th century before. So there is that tendency for the rate of profit to fall is actually borne out empirically in the evidence that we have. There are many measures of this, but they all broadly say the same thing. But is the rate of profit fallen because of Marx's law? Remember, Marx's law is saying that if the organic composition of capital rises more than the rate of exploitation or surplus value, then the rate of profit will fall. Are there other explanations for the fall in the rate of profit, like profit squeeze and so on? Well, here is the US non-financial sector since 1945. And if you look at the whole period, 1945 to 2020, in this case, you can see that there's the organic composition of capital. That's the amount spent on machinery, raw materials, technology compared to the amount spent on wages has risen by something like nearly 50% over that period of 75 years. On the other hand, the rate of surplus value, at least on this measure for the non-financial sector, has fallen, not risen. So capitalists have failed to exploit workers sufficiently to compensate for that rising organic composition of capital. So as a result, the rate of profit has fallen by something like 50% over that period of 75 years. If we take different periods, we can see that wherever a neoliberal period is a good one to look at, here the rate of surplus value has increased more than the organic composition of capital. So the rate of profit rose in this period from 1982 to 1997 in the case of the non-financial sector of the US. So exactly that. This, I think, demonstrates the theory is valid empirically, that if the rate of surplus value rises more, the counteracting factor rises more than the organic composition of capital, then the rate of profit, which is the grey bit here, will rise, not fall. But generally, this is one encircled here. This is the picture that we can see over the long term. And if we look at the US from 1960, but provided by, not by my figures, but by Basu and Wasner, they have a very good website on the rate of profit for the US, you can see generally this decline in the rate of profit with periods of upswing, which we can define. I like to define this period here as the neoliberal recovery, when capitalists closed down, smashed trade unions, moved industry to the poorer countries of the world to exploit the labor force there, globalization, if you like, privatized a lot of state industry, deregulated the economy so there were no restrictions on what they could do. All those factors which are part of the neoliberal policies that were introduced by the governments of the major economies during that period, they were able to get the rate of profit to ride for a certain period before the law began to operate again, I would say, throughout this 2.5 decades we've had so far this century. These blue dots are where we've had slumps, in major slumps in the world, in the major economies of the world, 1974-5, 1982, 1991, 2001, and of course the Great Recession, so-called, of 2008-9. Now, I'm going to argue, and this will be the argument I think is Marx's argument and Engels' argument, is that this fall in the rate of profit at a certain point creates the conditions for a slump in the economies of a capitalist system. And that we can show this empirically too. So that makes the rate of profit useful in us for understanding what is going on with the economy and whether there's going to be crisis. So if you think about it, if you look at the circular graph I do of the profit cycle here, here's the economy boosting along, accumulation, growth, acceleration, boom. But as the rate of profit starts to fall, eventually it reaches points when the mass of profit, the total amount of profit, falls. I'll explain that a bit more. So that new value stops rising. There's a fall in the total mass of profit, and you get a production and investment crisis. There's a collapse in investment, and then workers get laid off. Then they can't spend money. They haven't got the money anymore. So there's a crisis of being unable to sell goods or a lack of effective demand. So you can see it's the collapse in investment that leads to the collapse in effective demand, not the other way around. This could even trigger a financial collapse in the stock market and a slump and so on, as we've seen before. But after a time, once the rate of profit, once workers have lost their jobs, once there's been a collapse in many companies, they've been liquidated and taken over or disappear, then the rate of profit and the mass of profit begins to rise, because now labour costs have been reduced and investment can start rising again as the rate of profit rises, both in the financial sector maybe and also in the productive sector, and past losses have been written off, then the process of boom starts again. So you get a cyclical process going on here, based fundamentally on the rate of profit. And it's what Marx called a double-edged law. So it has a double edge. As the rate of profit falls in a capitalist economy, it's perfectly possible, indeed likely, that the mass of profit will rise. It's an arithmetic necessity, really. A falling rate actually implies a rising mass, because as the falling rate falls, capitalists try even harder to increase the mass of profit. So the mass and profit can rise and will rise as the rate of profit falls, keeping investment and production going as the rate of profit falls. It doesn't fall. So if the rate of profit falls, there's not necessarily a crisis straight away. But as the rate of profit falls, the increase in the mass of profit will eventually fall to the point of what you might call, or what is called, absolute overaccumulation. There's a certain point where further investment actually reduces profit. It's a tipping point for crisis. So if we can show that the rate of profit is connected to the mass of profit, and when the mass of profit falls, you get slumps, then you have that connection from this double-edged law. And here's the data for the US again. For the US rate of profit, both the rate of profit, which is the black block, and the growth in profits, the mass of profits, total profits, which is the slit bar, if you like. So you can see in these various recessions, the rate of profit falls by, in the case of 1958, by something like 15%, but it's combined with a fall during that recession of something like 9% of the mass. And you can see with virtually every crisis or slump in that period, the two things are connected together. And if we take the Great Recession, we can see the very big fall in the rate of profit from 2006 to 2009, which produces the fall in the mass of profit eventually of something like 12%. So there we had that connection between the rate and the mass of profit. So Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall has a connection to regular and recurring crises under capitalism when the rate and the mass come together. Finally, let me just say that this summarizes basically Marx's law, but there are two conclusions to reach from this, I think. One is that the law is a long-term secular tendency. You can see it takes place over not only decades, but even centuries. But also, it's a cyclical process, as the law is also an explanation of crises and booms and slumps. It's a combination of both. Some Marxists say that the first line, the law is just a long-term secular tendency and has nothing to do with crises. That's strongly supported by many people, Rosa Luxemburg being one of them, but others. And the second one is that actually the law is just showing how crises, booms and slumps take place, and it doesn't really have a long-term significance, because obviously if the rate of profit is falling over long term, it's increasingly difficult for capitalism to get out of its crises. So there's, as you might say, the life expectancy of capitalism is reaching the end if it's true that the long-term tendency has an important factor to play. But a lot of Marxists say that they're not interested in that. They just see it as booms and slumps. Some of them say it has nothing to do with crises. In my view, it's a combination of the two. That yes, it shows that over the long term, capitalism has a finite life. It cannot go on forever. That doesn't mean to say it's just going to collapse because the rate of profit falls. And in fact, if you do a bit of a mathematical calculation, each time there's a crisis, the rate of profit will rise again. And it's worked out that if you just do it very crudely, then on a world scale, if you like, the rate of profit would never get to zero before 2065, on the current prediction, if you like. But of course, every time there's a crisis, that shifts the rate of profit. So it's like a ever moving horizon, further and further away, but it shows the limits to capitalism in general. The second sentence shows that it also plays the role as an explanation of crises and in booms and slumps, and why capitalism has this continual process, not a harmonious growth and investment reduction, but a continual period of boom and slump, which lays people off, loses their livelihoods. Capitalist companies go to the wall and the whole process starts again. Or as to use Marx's phrase, the whole mess starts again. So you can see that it's both a cyclical and a cyclical consequences from the law of the tentative rate of profit to fall. So that is my summary of the general law. And from this, we hope to have good discussion.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Comrade, for the great presentation, very detailed and empirically rich. And it's always a pleasure to listen to you. So now the floor is open. So you can ask if you have any questions, you can post them on chat, or even you can ask them directly from Comrade Michael. And if you have any comments, just make sure to keep them shorter. And if you have any questions in Sinhala, we can translate them into English. So now the floor is open.
Dr. Sumanasiri, how that session that our plan will go on? Comment?
A little louder.
How's the plan about like my comment that you discussed, the 15-minute opportunity? Is it after the Q around, or is it in?
You can.
I cannot hear you.
Would you repeat your question, Tamalu?
Okay. It's more of a like there are detailed comments. Can you give me be a little bit slide sharing? It tackles several. It'll take some time.
Tamalu, I think you should ask it in a question form without actually trying to share your slides. Could you please kindly ask the question?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Then first if we go through that Okisho theorem one, that
yeah.
In the Okisho theorem, if the slides is a bit clear, but okay. In the Okisho theorem, I think the way you summarize the Okisho theorem is not actually accurate. So you said no individual capitalist would introduce a new technology unless it contributes to raising profits and market share and the rate of profit. So in your description, it says like with the initial capitalist who invent technology or adapt into technology will have a higher profit rate. So the profit rate will rise in the beginning, and then profit rate will fall when all the people using in that department of industry use the technology. So the profit rate will fall again. So I think Okisho covers all that. So even according to Marx, also written, Marx had written in third volume of Capital. So at first, for the initial adapters and the first innovator, the rate of profit will go rise, and then the rate of profit will fall again. But the problem is, where originally the rate of profit is at some level, then for certain kind of people it will rise only for a small fraction of them. Then for all the capitalists it will fall again. But that how it will end, when it end, the final level of the rate of profit will be greater than the rate of profit originally was, or it's lower than with the original level, or is it equal? And that's the real question I think Okisho trying to tackle. And he used so in your I have seen your videos, and in most of the cases you are going with one departmental analysis, and say Okisho is trying to average out the initial adapters profits over them. But when I see it, Okisho's argumentation, I cannot see that. Okisho, the point that you make is just an initial condition for Okisho's theorem. It is just a mathematical thing. But what he really speaks about is the final stage, how the rate of fall, rate of like how the rate of profit will finally fall. Will it be greater than the original value or not? So he's going through with that multi-department analysis, and using Stuffian models, and so using Stuffian models, and so after his calculations, he gets into the value that the very last final value when the technologies get widespread will become greater than rate of profit. But there can be countervailing tendency to that to go down, other factors. But generally, if you go with a multi-departmental analysis, and if you consider the transformational factor that Marx suggests to solve the transformation problem, then we can get a rise of rate of profit when the real wages are constant, according to Okisho theorem. That's what I have read, what I understood from what I have read from Okisho. And I think your argumentation doesn't address that.
Thank you, Tamil. Comrade, you can reply. Comrade Michael, thanks.
Can I? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll deal with this question now. I'm going to show you a couple of slides that I left out to help us to see where I'm going on this. So let me just see if I can get them up. So let's get up to the okay. No, that's not it.
I believe that's the next.
Nearly there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I showed you that, but let me just give you some of the things that's mentioned by on Okisho's assumptions. And I'm just going to quote Okisho here. He says that my theorem is a comparative statics result. Therefore, it has no realistic meaning if capitalist competition does not establish a new equilibrium. Now, many people have criticized my theorem. He doesn't think his theorem is wrong. And I think if you look at the mathematics of Okisho's theorem, there's nothing wrong with it. However, he says, I now think my assumptions were inappropriate. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, I consider the assumptions. Take number one. He starts, as do a lot of others, with one commodity production. So he's going to measure things in terms of the production of things, the output, the physical things. He's not going to measure the production of value. He's going to measure output. So if I've got, he has to therefore, to make it commensurate, he has to start with corn or with wheat and then have more wheat or more corn. He can't have, as is realistic in the world, he can't have raw materials that produce motor cars. They're not commensurate as physical things. They're only commensurate, Marx would argue, if you measure the number of hours of labor, value contained in them. That's the only way you can make them commensurate. But Okisho is not interested in the value approach. He's interested in the physical approach. Therefore, you have to have one commodity. So if you only have one commodity in an economy, it's not a very realistic assumption, is it? So that's one thing. And that's why he looks at physical output, not in terms of value terms, which I think makes it rather unrealistic to use. So even if the model and the mathematics are right, the assumptions start looking inappropriate, to use his word. He also, Okisho says, what capitalists are engaged in is reducing their costs. Well, Yes, they want to reduce their costs by introducing new machinery and to make it cheaper to get an advantage. But they also, to do that, they have to increase the productivity of labor. So the price per output, the value starts to fall per unit of output as a result of introducing new technology that the capitalists are trying to reduce their costs with. So on the one hand, costs come down, so profits should go up. On the other hand, the value or price per unit starts to fall, so there's a squeeze on profits from that angle. So we have not straightforwardly, therefore, an increase in the rate of profit simply by capitalists introducing new technology. And when overall the price per unit falls, which it will do if the organic composition of capital rises and value doesn't match the increase in investment, and the number of hours being used by necessary for workers to produce the original amount of output falls, then the rate of profit will fall. And then perhaps probably one of the most important assumptions that he makes is that the price of a commodity that is being produced at the end of its production is going to be the same as the price that it was at the beginning of the production with all the imports. And more than that, if the price is, say, was started with 100 and then you finish up with a price at 90 because there's been an increase in productivity, just to solve the problem, you convert the output price to 90, which is 90. You convert the import price to the same figure, 90. Why? How do you do that? That's not realistic. You cannot. When we start production process, any capitalist, he starts with the amount, he or she starts with an amount of goods and so on at certain prices, machinery, raw materials, and so on. It's not going to be the same price when the output is produced of a different commodity altogether. And yet, actually, if you look at the assumption is that the two prices don't change. And indeed, the input price will now will become whatever the output price is. And finally, another assumption is there's one capitalist, there's no competition. Where is the competition between capitalists over this process? It seems to be missing from the whole process that Akisho presents. Let me give you a quick game theory example, not by me, but by another Marxist economist. Say there are two capitalists, A and B. Each starts with 3 in profit. Now, if neither capitalists, A and B, do anything about innovation and just carry on, then profit stays for 3 at A and it stays for B at 3. But if, say, A introduces a new technology to try and get an advantage, reduces its costs, and B does not, then A gets a higher profit, say it goes to 4, while B therefore loses market share and gets less profit, say to 1. Alternatively, if A does not innovate and B does, then it's the other way around. But note that in the process of introducing new technology, there will be an increased level of productivity, which means that the total value per unit of output will fall. So total out value falls from 6 to 5. If both innovate, total value falls to 4, and A gets 2 and B gets 2. So in the process of one innovating, the total value will fall, and A will end up with 4 and B will lose to 1. But if both of them innovate, then total value will actually fall even more because they're both increasing the productivity of labor as such, and they'll end up sharing it 2 and 2. So there's a drive to innovate because A and B could raise the profit from 3 to 4, but there cannot necessarily be an agreement not to innovate, keeping things at heart. There's a pressure all the time to innovate, first to get to 4, so the other must do so or its profit will fall to 1. So there's, with both innovating, they end up on 2, but fundamentally what's happening is that overall the profit will be falling from 6 to 5 to 4, depending on how much innovation takes place. And therefore, the reality is, over a period of time, what you get through innovation by different capitalists is a fall in the rate of profit because the price per unit is falling and that the sharing out of profit with the same level, the new level of organic composition is now applying. So I think my arguments against the Akisho theorem is that it's not real. It's not realistic. You can take some assumptions and you can come up with your result, but that's like any mathematical formula. You should start with the question of, are those assumptions realistic? and what happens in a capitalist economy in reality, not what Akisho wants to come up with, which is a mathematical formula. I can't deal with the transformation problem. In my view, there is no problem, but that's again a secondary question which we could also discuss. And it's absolutely right that if you accept the critique of Marx's transformation of values into prices, which many Marxist economists do, then the rate of profit law will also fall. The two things go together, but that's a separate discussion. Anyway, I've gone too long on that, and I apologize for that. If people want to come back and hit me on this, please do so.
Okay. First, couple of things about those assumptions. I think the first one, the competition one. I think in the Okisho's original formulation, it's rather vague. But if we go to something like John Romer's some proof of it and kind of things, I believe he considered competition. And in the other end, there is the major thing. I think mostly your argument is based on that input price and output prices are in the like normal formulation of Okisho theorem. We consider like input price equals to output price and do the calculation, and it's wrong. I think Andrew Kleeman and like TSI theorists also suggest the same kind of thing. That one I have a little bit problem. Like it's easy to say, like we know with transformation problem and this, there's a redundancy in a question after the transformation factor, but after that, if we leave out that for a moment, there is some kind of redundancy. So the way to solve that issue is anyway to introduce more variables. So introducing the easiest way to introducing variables is make input prices different from output prices, and say these things are not. It's not realistic to say those two input prices to equal with output prices. That's a way to get around with math. I agree with that. Like if we go with that, we can calculate and get a perfectly reasonable value agreeing with Marx. But the problem is, again, when we consider these input output, it's going with cycles. So there's an input. So from one capitalist cycle, so there is a generate output. Now there's output prices. It will be the input to the next cycle. So again, another output will come. So the input prices and output prices will be different, and it will happen again and again and again. One output becomes the other input. So now all those equations, we can write it down. So all those equations for a large number of cycles that are going away. And actually, if we write the two equations down, we can sum those equations together and average out. When even if we do not go with the assumption input prices are equal to output prices, still holding that they can be different in a particular cycle, we can write large number of cycles together and average out. It's like getting expectation value of both sides of the equation, and the expected values of the both sides of the equation and input prices and output prices should be equal at the end. So even if we ignore the assumption that input prices should be equal to output prices, still we can get it from the argumentation. That's my argument about it.
Comrade, you can reply, but before replying, you can see there's another question in the
Yes, good question too.
So you can,
Yeah.
combine your reply.
I don't think Tamalu and I can resolve this very easily over this Zoom discussion. Perhaps I'm very happy to do an email discussion with them at some time if he wants. All I can say is that I'll leave people to, I'll put my slides up. I'll put them in the chat later so that people can review them over, and Tamalu can have another look as well, so that we can discuss this as we go down. But as he knows, and probably others do, this has been a long-standing discussion amongst Marxist economists for what? Well,
I agree.
he wrote it in 1964, I think. So
there's a discussion. Marx himself came with that also.
Yeah.
Heinrich says Marx himself came with that.
It's a long time, so there's plenty of discussion that's been on it, and so we've got. I'm sure we can continue this discussion further. All I would add on this now is that just leave the theory for a moment and look at the empirics. The data shows that there has generally been a fall in the rate of profit over the last 150 years, on and off, with uprises. So now you could argue that it's nothing to do with Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I would argue that's not the case, that there is evidence to show that the two connected. So from that point of view alone, I think there's an argument that supports Marx's law. But let me just quickly deal with the question that's been raised in the chat by Galib. Very good question. What happens if everything is automated and robots produce robots, and there's no human labor involved in production? Does that mean that the labor theory of value is wrong? Well, what it means is that labor theory of value is irrelevant, because there is no value being produced. If Marx's labor theory of value is that value is only produced by workers and is created by workers, if workers go to work, if there's no workers don't go to work, no value is produced. Yes, that means that in a fully automated society where everything is produced by machines and nothing is produced by labor, there is no value. But is that capitalism anymore? That's not capitalism. That's something else again. A society where, if you like, I used to describe it as saying it's a bit like a slave society. You've probably got a small group of people owning everything, all these machines and factories, and the machines do everything for this small group of people, and they get all the resources that they want. And if we're living in such an unequal society, the rest of us are either starving or getting handouts from the people who own all the robots. I would think that if we ever reach that point, I don't think that the 8 billion people in this world will put up with 50,000 people controlling everything through robots. And well, there are plenty of movies that have done it, so you can think of it that way. But that would not be capitalism anymore. That will not be the process of exploiting labor anymore and selling the goods and services that labor produces on the market. It will be a sort of slave economy where the slaves are robots. And maybe it will be a communist economy, because that would inevitably be the process of collectively owning such a situation. And in that case, of course, the second part of the question is, yes, as we move towards such a position where there's increased mechanization, more robots, and less labor relatively, the rate of profit will fall further. So that would increase the intensity of crises within capitalism before we get to the fully automated economy. Yeah, I think Galib has summed it up very well, that actually what's most likely to happen realistically with AI and all the rest of it is that we'll increase the intensity of crises under capitalism over a period of time. Then it's up to us. Do we accept that the small group of capitalists will take over everything and run it on their part using robots while we presumably wait for our handout in the streets, or like proletariat did in Rome? Or do we take over the economy in the interests of everybody and remove the owners of the robots so that they're collectively owned and producing the things we need as a whole? So the way in which Galib has posed the two questions, he in a way answers himself so very well.
Thanks, comrade. Anybody? Questions, comments? Just Galib, do you have a question, a follow-up, maybe?
Actually, thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Robert. But I would like to say that, what if the means of production is owned by the only handful of people? Then it would remain the capitalism, right?
Yeah.
It will be the capitalism will still survive if the means of production in a fully automated society, the means of production is in the hands of a few people. Then there will be still capitalism.
Well, you could call it capitalism if you want. Yeah, it would be a hugely unequal society. It wouldn't be the exploitation of labor anymore, because no labor will be exploited. So that what you've got is the production of goods and services which the capitalists, these people, the owners of the robots, own, and they would either consume themselves, or if they feel like it, give it to the rest of us to keep us going. But basically, they wouldn't need us anymore to exploit. So it would be a different sort of system, in my view. That's why I describe it more, not so much as a capitalist economy, but more of a slave economy, where instead of slaves, we have robots and automated systems. We have the owners of those slaves and robots, and the rest of us are like what happened in Rome, where the majority of free men had no job at all, no work at all. They would have to wait for bread and circuses or the handouts from the slave owners. Now, so I'm not sure. I think it's a little bit different from being a capitalist system. If we mean by the exploitation of labor, that's how capitalists get their profit and control the means of production over and accumulate that. We've reached the point where they've accumulated everything and there's no labor involved. It's a sort of different society. Still a horrible one. And it's one that we couldn't possibly put up with as humanity if we wanted to progress, because it wouldn't be progressing. And as you make point, Galib, that before we even get there, there's likely to be major crises of the capitalist system itself as the rate of profit falls further and intensifies the struggle over profit, and therefore the need to exploit workers further, intensifying the class conflict. Just finish on this point. We're talking economics here. There is no guarantee that working people will succeed in removing these systems and replacing it with a democratic, communal, socialist, cooperative system in place of this. There's no guarantee of that. That's political action. That requires political action. If it doesn't happen, we either descend into this nightmare or into a system of barbarism. Everything goes backwards as a result of reaction, war, and other conflicts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we can spend a few more minutes for questions and comments. Who wants to go next?
Can I share many?
Yeah,
Is that okay? Yeah. About the point being discussed, but I think what I see here, it's a process, and when looking at the rapid pace of automation day by day, what's actually happening, I think the fixed part of the capital, the portion of the fixed part of the capital is growing rapidly against the variable part of the capital. So it itself generates a even more unstable situation, because how far this process can go. So rather than thinking an ideal state where there will be one day wholly automated world, many things should be happening before that, because this portion of fixed to variable capital will the change of that will ultimately, like Hegel said, will ultimately make it itself is a different. It will change from quantitative to it should change from a quantitative aspect to a qualitative aspect. So this is why I think the capitalist system is that is the problem of the capitalist system, I suppose. There are many people we see in the world who believe that capitalist system will be going forever, but this particular aspect shows us that it can't go like that. It should fall down at one point. Thank you for attention.
Wait, I think it's more like a comment from Anura. Thank you, Aruna, for participating. Yeah, we can spend a few more minutes for questions and comments. Anyone? Comrade, since others are silent, can I ask a question? I mean, I too was actually interested in Marx's hypotheses and working on a couple of models. And what do you think about the idea that how appropriate Marx's using Marx's theses, using Marx's hypotheses for countries like Sri Lanka, for the underdeveloped world? And I know you cannot predict the empirical implications, but how appropriate and what kind of indicators, what kind of accounts that we should use if we're actually dealing with the question of context of underdeveloped world?
Well, I think what we've just been discussing today, it's not complete, is that the law of the tendency rate of profit fall is a very good indicator of the state of the capitalist economy and in its health over a period and the trend that it's going in. So if the rate of profit is generally rising in an economy, it could do for decades. The best example in the advanced capitalist world has been quite a sharp rise in the rate of profit in Australia for many years, up until the beginning of this century. Huge expansion of population, a high concentration in technology to produce minerals for export. So it's been a relatively successful economy, and the rate of profit demonstrates that. So that's a good guide. But also, if the rate of profit begins to turn in a different direction, which it has in Australia, by the way, and in any other country, then that tells you that the pressures on capitalism to develop and to meet social need is increasingly difficult, and that will produce a increased caste conflict in that domestic economy if the rate of profit is falling. I did a little paper in World in Crisis book, which you mentioned, called on the UK rate of profit, and it is quite a good simulation between what happens to the rate of profit and the changes that took place in the British economy and the caste conflict that took place as well. So that Britain ended up not being a hegemonic leading economic power, became the weak one. And God help us here in 2024, back here in London, the UK economy is a complete disaster at the moment. And that's an indication of the whole process that's taken place in the profitability of British capital during the 21st century, which has just gone down from 1997 on official figures, not even on mine. So it's a good indicator. Of course, it's not the only indicator. We also want to look at the level of real wages for workers, the inequalities in an economy, which are huge. The bigger the inequalities in an economy, the more the tension and social tension will exist in an economy. Lots of this data can be found for countries just like Sri Lanka. We can do this, so it will give us a guide to where the process is going. And also, obviously, we can look at mainstream indicators, the growth in real output, the growth in investment, and so on. These are, and the growth in credit. All these things are factors that connect together. But the underlying driver will be what's happening to the profitability of capital in an economy. So if we're trying to analyze our own economy, like Sri Lanka, given the data best we can, then these are the areas that you want to be concentrating on. In the case of countries like Sri Lanka, there is another big factor, of course, is that they are dominated, their elites and the people who are exploited by huge imperialist companies from the big imperialist powers, and from countries that are nearby as well, if they've got that influence. So that means that their economies are very much dependent on what happens to the decision-making made by multinational companies in their country about whether to invest or not, whether to leave, how many people to employ. This is a little bit different then from, say, the United States, but no country is an island, no economy is an island. Even the US is subject to the impact of what's happening in other countries. As we now can see with China's rise, this frightens the US. But lots of what used to be called third world countries, or what is collectively called the global south, 100 economies in the world now have got debt problems, major foreign debt problems. Sri Lanka, of course, we know about very well, but 100, according to the World Bank, have major debt problems that cannot be resolved easily because of the pressure of imperialist powers and the running up of debt to these people and the inability to pay that back. So I think levels of debt, that these countries have is an important reflection on what's happening and what forces them, their governments, however good they are or however bad they are, to make decisions which are against the interests of the population, because they have no other way of meeting these demands for imperialism. So in the case of Sri Lanka, it's not just the rate of profit, it's also the foreign debt, how that's going to be dealt with, whether there's sufficient exploitation of the workers to deal with these things. These are a number of factors that are involved in the case of countries like Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? We can entertain one more question. Comrade Sumanasirilena, do you have any comments, questions? Can you hear us?
Mike, in one of your recent articles, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, yes, perfectly. Yes.
Yeah, in one of your recent articles, you mentioned Jamaica as one of the countries that were able to resolve kind of economic crisis. Could you say something more about Jamaican situation?
Yeah,
and how
it surprised me a bit, but recently there's been some reports coming out of mainstream economists and so on who've done reports on Jamaica and saying, great, Jamaica's solved its debt problem. It's cut its debt by half in the last 10 years, and it hasn't collapsed, and employment is okay. So there you go. All this talk by leftist economists that poor countries like Jamaica and Sri Lanka are being oppressed by imperialism is nonsense. All they have to do is get their own act together and start dealing with their debt and be sensible adults and get it sorted. And what is the solution? Well, we have to raise more taxes from the population, and we have to reduce the spending that we've got on public services and other things. So we run a surplus on our budgets. And in the case of Jamaica, they ran a surplus for the last 10 years, and they've managed to get their debt down as a result. So success story, you see. Mainstream economics has a solution that doesn't require socialism in Jamaica. Well, a couple of things to say about that. First of all, Jamaica is even tinier than Sri Lanka. I mean, this is a tiny island with hardly much production going on, fairly small population. And if you look at the data, which I had a quick look at, which is in the post, that actually the per capita income, that's the amount of income per person in Jamaica, hasn't increased for 10 years. So yes, well, if you don't allow anybody in the country, or at least 99% of the people in the country, to gain no income for 10 years, any improvement in their living standards for 10 years, and everything that they produce goes towards the government making them pay more taxes and reducing the spending on public services, then you can get the debt down. For what purpose? Actually, the authors of the report summed it up as I mentioned in the post. They say, well, we're not quite sure what this done to the health service or the education service over the last 10 years by following this policy of fiscal prudence and austerity. Maybe they aren't quite as good as they could have been. Well, yes, it's pretty sure it's the case that if you go to Jamaica, the roads are rubbish, the health service is struggling, education for the kids is not great. And that is all to get the debt down, so that the foreign companies and banks who have lent money to Jamaica are getting their money back. Well, thank you.
Okay. One last question, maybe. One comment, maybe. Who wants to ask the...
Hello, can I ask another question?
Yes, Khalid, go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I would like to ask another question to Mr. Michael Roberts, though it is not on today's topic, but I have an interest in it, so I'd like to ask it. I would like to know Mr. Roberts' view on cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. What does he think about it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
Can
I recently did a post on Bitcoin again, done a few posts, but if you go to my blog site, which Kalpa has mentioned, quite recently I did a Bitcoin post because, as you know, recently one of the great rock stars of the Bitcoin, Sam Friedman, has been arrested and thrown in jail for 25 years because he pinched all the money that the investors gave to him for his Bitcoin operation. So I wrote a little post about the nature of Bitcoin, and very quickly to say what Bitcoin is doing is trying to say that we don't need government currencies. We don't need currencies controlled by the US government, US dollar. Sri Lanka doesn't need to worry about US dollar debt because it could have a currency which is international, which is open to the individuals of Sri Lanka to buy and sell through their computers with software, and they can buy these Bitcoins, and this will become the currency. And they can go down to the shops and use a Bitcoin to pay for things, and it's not controlled by the US government and the US dollar anymore. And this will do away with the oppression that people had through money by governments and central banks of the big countries. So the Sri Lankan currency doesn't matter anymore because we're using an international currency like Bitcoin and many others that have been produced. It's all decentralized. You and me, Galib, can trade our Bitcoins across the computer using a decentralized, safe process, nothing to do with government, to enable us to buy and sell things. Well, sounds a great idea. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked, has it? Because what's happened, of course, is inevitably under capitalism, this Bitcoin process has been taken over by a small group of Bitcoin miners who have control over the production of Bitcoins, and through capitalist Bitcoin exchanges where people buy and sell Bitcoins and speculate on them. And we can see that Bitcoins have not become currencies of the world. One or two countries, El Salvador and others, have tried to introduce Bitcoins or other cryptocurrencies to replace their own currency or the dollar. It hasn't worked because there is no feeling amongst people that Bitcoins could do that. Bitcoins rockets down. You know, the average of one Bitcoin costs $68,000 at the moment, and then 3 months ago it cost $21,000. Now you can't conduct your average transactions every day on the basis of that sort of volatility that you get in a currency. When currencies get that volatile or collapse that much, people give up using currencies and they buy and sell cigarettes between them or whatever. They do something else. They don't use that money. And that's applying to Bitcoin. Bitcoin has not replaced the fiat currencies or the currencies of governments, and therefore it's been a failure in that area. It's now just become another speculative asset. There are lots of speculative financial assets. There's bonds and stocks, there's art paintings, there's all kinds of digital objects that you can buy and sell. There's gold. Bitcoin's another one of those. So the promoters of Bitcoin remain convinced that this will be a great thing, and they advocate it all the time. But really, it's just only rich people speculate in Bitcoins and invest in Bitcoin exchanges. And anyway, when they invest, they want to convert the money back to dollars or euros. They don't keep it in Bitcoins indefinitely because they can't spend it. So that the idea that this is going to replace existing money, unfortunately, is not the case. So the great futurist aim of an international currency fails on the anvil of capitalism, which continues to control it. And what's happened is that Bitcoin is now controlled on the whole by a bunch of criminals, really, and scammers.
Thanks, Comrade Michael, for the reply.
Thank you.
Galib, also I have put a message on the chat. Maybe you can do a further reading of this book, Capitalism, by Michael Roberts and Guglielmo.
And I've also put the slides up there on the
Yes, great.
chat as well in a PDF format for you guys to look at when you want.
Great. So there's a chapter actually in this book about Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and so actually they are dealing with the matters. So thank you very much again. So I think it's the high time to wrap up today's session. We once again would like to thank Comrade Michael for kindly accepting our invitation. It was a great session. I think there are many questions, comments, but the time has come to end the session. So thank you once again for joining us today, and especially the international community, some of the comrades from Bangladesh, Britain. So thank you so much for joining us. And we are looking forward to have Michael for another session. Maybe Bitcoin could be possibly a topic for another discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for inviting me. And if Tom Harlan wants to contact me, please give him my email and we'll
Okay, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.